Boa tarde a todas e a todos. Meu nome é Tatiana Oliveira, eu sou assessora política do INESC, uma organização da sociedade civil brasileira sediada em Brasília. Hoje nós faremos o terceiro encontro do ciclo de debates preparatórios para a Assembleia da REBRIP, a Rede de Integração dos Povos. Antes de iniciar o nosso debate, eu quero explicar um pouco o que é a REBRIP. A REBRIP é uma articulação da sociedade civil brasileira dedicada ao diálogo e à divulgação de iniciativas populares frente aos tratados de desregulamentação financeira e comercial, nos quais incluem-se tratados bi- e plurilaterais de comércio. Essa rede foi formada com base no posicionamento conjunto de que acordos comerciais e de investimento tendem a privilegiar as grandes empresas transnacionais em detrimento dos povos. Isso significa que é preciso ficar de olho nesses acordos, nos termos da sua negociação e da sua implementação. Muitas vezes, as discussões que envolvem a política internacional parecem muito distantes, cada vez mais frequente que aspectos fundamentais da vida cotidiana.
However, the crucial aspects of everyday life, access to treatment and to medication, as we saw during this pandemic, are defined in international spaces, and by means of those agreements and other types of agreements, international agreements, be them trade-related or not. Obviously, this poses a crucial question to democracy, because it is hard enough to keep track in Brazil the dynamics of the National Congress, and it is even more difficult to keep track of the international levels of debate, or even trying to influence the international instances of global governance. So this is why we invite you to this conversation now, in an attempt to bring these discussions to the broader public of a Brazilian civil society. As I said initially, today's talk is part of this cycle of preparatory debates for the REBRIP Assembly. Before today's debate, we already had a couple of discussions. The first one was on the WTO reform, and another one was on the impact of free trade agreements, the impacts of those agreements on women's work. And in this third encounter, the discussion today is going to revolve around environmental policies, more specifically, how the agreements between Mercosur and European Union and between Mercosur and EFTA affect the now shaky, let's put it this way, the socio-environmental policy and Brazilian policies. The subsequent meetings will address negotiation of intellectual property and digital economy. So I would like to invite all of you who are listening to us now to also participate in the future discussions we have scheduled. I will tell you now a little bit about how our debate is going to be structured, and right away I will pass the floor to our guest speakers. After this very brief introduction, Ademar Mineiro is an economist and a REBRIP member. He will make a brief presentation on the main points related to these two agreements that I just mentioned, Mercosur and European Union and Mercosur in EFTA, based on a publication that was made in a partnership between INESC and REBRIP, where Ademar has authored that paper, and she's going to be presenting to you a little bit of this presentation. REBRIP is actually republishing the paper, and then I will pass the floor to Tom Curtius, who's an activist of this organization headquartered in Spain. He's going to be telling us a little more about the environmental clause of the agreement, particularly of the European Union Mercosur Agreement. And then we will open up the floor for questions and answers between myself, Tom, and Adamar, and also to contributions that come to us by means of the uh, chat feature of the YouTube channels, which are transmitting this conversation. So, right away, I would like to encourage all of you who are watching us to send us your questions, your comments through the YouTube channels that are being used for this transmission. Then we will close the event. So, without further ado, I would like to invite Ademar Mineiro to start this talk. So, please, Ademar, can you then give us an overview of this agreement so that we are all brought to the same page for this conversation? And also, please help us understand why we should take positions against this agreement. Why do we refer to this agreement as a neo-colonial agreement? Why don't we believe that the Brazilian civil society has struck the same chord by saying that we do not believe that any incremental change to this agreement will ever be able to solve the various and very severe problems that the Brazilian civil society as well as the European civil society have pointed about it. So you have the floor, Ademar. Thank you very much once again for this conversation. Thank you, Tatiana. I would like to welcome you all, Tatiana and Tom, a good old friend I'm seeing again now. During these pandemic times, we do not have panel members, we have screen members. So we have our screen members, our screen co-workers for this discussion today, which will revolve around the trade agreement, this one particularly on the environmental effects of the Mercosur agreement with the European Union and the EFTA. These agreements, particularly the one involving the European Union, actually started back in the 1990s, last century, the negotiations have been going on for around 25 years with ups and downs. In 2004, it was almost broken after this negotiation were held in Brasilia. Since negotiators are very skillful, instead of breaking it up, they put it on hold. So they left it to wait, but they didn't break it. And as of the beginning of this last decade of the century, then President Lula, in a statement made to the Ibero-American Summit meeting, he said, "Why don't we resume those talks?" At that moment, he was actually trying to kindle an ash that was about to blow away. So his intention was to resume those conversations a little bit stronger after 2012, and that was the moment when talks with the EFTA started. EFTA is a small group, a group of small countries in Europe who are not member of the European Union. The main ones are Switzerland and Norway, and then Liechtenstein and Finland. So this group of 4 countries compose this group. Evidently, the effects of these agreements with the WEFTA are smaller than the ones with the European Union because of the volume of trade is smaller. And this agreement, since countries, in the case of WEFTA, they have a little bit of an autonomy, so negotiations of trade liberalization actually take place on a case-by-case basis, which makes for smaller effects. So what happens in these agreements are interesting because when the agreements are mentioned, the Itamaraty usually say that those agreements have somewhat similar structure. They follow the same lines. And in this talk with the WEFTA, they were fast because it had already been discussed with the European Union, showing that these agreements Apart from these irregularities concerning the area of some commercial products, they actually move along the same line, which is the overall direction of the WTO back in the 1990s. Because those agreements, particularly the Mercosur-European Union, was designed back in the 1990s. Therefore, at the conclusion of the agreement, considerations was made about new discussions in the investment area, but that was not in the initial framework of those negotiations. Not because it was originally designed back in the 1990s when there were not so many demands or requirements in that area, though the Brazilian government's liberal view would not accept those possibilities. Now, after those long conversations, those agreements moved on as of the Temer administration. And during the Bolsonaro administration, particularly at a moment when we also had the Argentinian case as one of the main countries in the Mercosur, Brazil and Argentina, with the Macri administration. And then we advanced in the discussions in the sense of closing this liberalization deal. The Mercosur agreement with the European Union has three different legs. There's a trade agreement, there's a cooperation agreement, and there's a political agreement. So it's a little broader than a commercial agreement or trade agreement, but the emphasis was more on the trade agreement. And the trade agreement is, as I said, the one that was originally designed by the 1990s WTO, meaning it takes into consideration not only the liberalization of the trade in goods, but also liberalization in services area, investment, governmental procurement, which were included as they did not, that they were not part of the original scope of those negotiations. That was only introduced after 2004, and this attempt to close that deal, an attempt that eventually failed. So when you start talking about it, or you resume talks, actually you start from where you had stopped, and that included this area of governmental procurement. So that is why it's taken into consideration now. In an attempt to start answering one of Tatiana's question, why do we say that this agreement has colonial or neo-colonial guidelines? Because you're actually providing for Mercosur countries to fit in this international trade chain, but based on the design of the colonial area, major agricultural and mineral exporters, agricultural commodities, mineral commodities, and partly energy when it comes to alcohol and oil. So, on the other hand, both European Union and the EFTA countries, they develop an expertise in trading on manufactured goods, particularly the ones that have higher added value or more technology involved. And as a consequence, they are also seize a portion of the market of governmental procurement, and they are given liberalization in the services area, where many of those countries are service providers. They have many companies providing services in many different areas. They are given investment collaterals, investment guarantees. So this is why we say that this agreement has these colonial characteristics deep down. So you are recolonizing Mercosur countries as exports and exporting agricultural, mineral, and energy commodities. Because of this structural characteristic alone, without touching on any other, and I'm actually going to share details of this discussion in the chapter that addresses more specifically the environmental issue. but it also addresses social issues, which perhaps Tom is going to be addressing this theme a little more closely. But from this introduction alone, you will receive a big environmental impact in the Mercosur countries, because we know that the main mean effect on the environment in the countries in that region is exactly increased production of agricultural commodities, not only agricultural, but mineral and energy commodities as well. Before the agreement, this was accelerated with a trade standard that these countries have with China, which grew substantially since the first decade in this century. China is a major partner to all of those countries, and basically on this design, meaning increasing trade with the European Union and EFTA, and this model provides for privilege to include in Mercosur as a producer of primary products. So that's actually going to enhance these effects that are already in place with the production of those goods, which is the way in which Mercosur has actually fit in the international trade. Now, this initial design per se represents a major impact. We are well aware of the effect of mining and oil exploration, and the effect of large export commercial agriculture, which has been given this new name, agribusiness, but deep inside, it's actually make up on the old exporting agricultural model. And the environmental effects have been clearly felt. Those impacts hit the entire production chain. You see that getting sharper and sharper, including a productive package from the agricultural area that moves to the region. So you actually have two alternatives from the point of view of increasing production, agricultural and cattle raising activities, if you encourage that by means of those incentives. One is to increase the production area, and we know increasing that area means gigantic impact on the forest reservation areas, indigenous reservations, reservations of social sectors such as quilombolas. So the effect is there, and if we associate that with a certain environmental disregard for that from the Bolsonaro administration, we have been able to feel the impacts in these 2.5 years of this initial administration in the case of Brazil. That's the first element. Now, the second element, even when you fail to increase the area for production, that means you are going to intensify production in the existing areas. And intensifying that production in the existing areas, even within this technological package, what you have is you are actually importing an important portion of the input that's necessary for that production. Those countries with which you engage in trade agreements, that means increasing use of fertilizers and other chemicals which have a negative environmental impact, meaning if you increase production to tap from these opportunities brought by the international trade, there will be negative effects from the environmental point of view. And if you intensify production without increasing the area, it will also have negative effects, which are increasing the use of fertilizers and chemicals, which eventually end up in water and are harmful to the soil and to the region as a whole, which includes harming other areas of agricultural production. In this case, we're talking about agriculture that's more concerned with the environmental issues, which is more diversified, family agriculture, family farming, agriculture that respects environmental standards. So those are the effects. Again, the first important element is this one. Now, the other element is the one that we can look at from the point of view of industry, because even for the industrial sectors, which you still can take to Mercosur countries, for instance, what is supported for the European countries, both the European Union countries and the WEFTA countries, is to get rid of industrial production, which is environmentally harmful for these countries. So, what you bring to the Mercosur area is the productive sectors which are most contaminated, which are more energy intensive sectors. And we know energy generation also has relevant environmental effects which are negative. So, given all of these aspects, agreements that are being designed with WEFTA and with the European Union, agreements which are going through a moment when they are being discussed for approval, they're being translated, and their legal points are being brought up. But deep inside, what's happening is a discussion on how to approve them at the level, at the national level, their national parliaments. And this is an important moment to mobilize the civil society in order to look at the effects of these agreements, particularly the ones which have environmental effects, in order to defend major changes to those agreements, and preferably that those agreements are never signed, so that they can be deactivated or just disregarded, so we can start discussing alternatives that will be both socially and environmentally healthy from the point of view of the local country's development. And in the interest of time, I've already been given some yellow cards by Tatiana. That is what I wanted to share with you, and we're going to have a discussion after the interventions provided by Tom and Tatiana herself. So thank you very much. Thank you, Ademar. Strictly adhering to time, which allows us to give more time for debate. So that's very important. And since Ademar made this transition between showing us a little bit of the architecture of those agreements and how they were negotiated along the time, and concluded his talk by addressing the central element in this talk, which is the environmental clause and the social environmental impacts generated by these agreements, I'd like to continue along this theme with Tom Kuchart and ask him to elaborate on this discussion around the environmental clause and the social environmental clause of those agreements, and the environmental clauses of this agreement, particularly the one between the European Union and Mercosur, the ones that can be generated by this agreement. So welcome, Tom, and thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be sharing this webinar with friends from Brazil and the Brazilian Network for the Integration of the Peoples, brothers and sisters who have been fighting together and resisting. And I would like to express my gratitude to RIBRIB, to INESC, and to EQUIT for the invitation to participate in this debate. The first thing I'd like to do is to express my solidarity with the social moment and the fight that's going on in Brazil and in the Mercosur countries, because we are going through days, particularly now when we are organizing this webinar, there's this big fight against a law that looks at increasing environmental devastation, the deforestation, and land grabbing and increasing crime against indigenous peoples and family farming. So this bill of law, which is now being discussed in the Brazilian Congress at the lower chamber, and there's this big fight being waged in order to stop this law. And also because a few months ago, the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Spain, she showed this photograph with Jair Bolsonaro. I am ashamed by this photo, but I would also like to use this opportunity to signal that the civil society of the Spanish state does not agree with this commercial diplomacy, continuity of the liberal trade policies of the Spanish government, which is known as a progressive government in many parts of the world. So I would like to use this early moments of my intervention to clarify that that photograph does not represent the Minister of Foreign Affairs, which who was replaced with another minister just this weekend. But I would like to leave this message for the Brazilian civil society. Just to clarify to all of you who are watching us, Tom is making reference to the so-called PL, which is a bill of law of the land grabbing. This one that's being discussed as a matter of urgency, and it is indeed a big fight in the country now. And I can talk about this bill of law a little bit later, and also about other bills of law which affect and destroy the socio-environmental governance in Brazil. Thanks, Tom, for reminding us of that and making reference to this very important moment we're going through right now. Because when we talk about trade between the European Union and Mercosur, we talk about many decades in which this trade has been going on, and by means some means of communication is responsible, the officials who are responsible for that start to cry because there are environmental fires and there's the devastation. So we have to clarify that when forest fires increase, it's actually to increase the imports of iron or sugar and others. That is the most crucial political and social relation we have to clarify before we start talking about the content or the potential impacts of a trade agreement in the future, because there is an ongoing trade relation which is absolutely criminal. And there are people who are responsible for that within transnational companies, but also within the governments on the Mercosur side and on the European Union side, which have been fostering this criminal trade in the course of many years. This is why I would like to start by sharing this very important piece of data. When we say that there is ongoing environmental destruction in Mercosur countries, approximately 120,000 hectares, 120,000 hectares every year are deforested in Mercosur countries because of exports of raw materials to the European Union. So there's direct relation there. This is why the European Union is one of the main economic players that cause climate change, that cause reduced biodiversity and the destruction of ecosystems, which are reported in many different reports by the United Nations and by other national, regional, and international entities. And before I start to explain some of the issues involved in those environmental clauses in this agreement, I would like to draw a few lines about the context where we are right now. Because the European Union has presented themselves for decades as an economic and political power at the world level, and they are losing this economic and political power. Therefore, it's very important for European elites to have these types of trade agreements with the intention of proceeding with a geopolitical fight with other players who are actually deceiving with economic and political power, such as China, for instance. And it's very interesting to observe that the coronavirus pandemic has shown to us that the trade policy, the globalizing trade policy, was not only useless to live up to the pandemic, but also, or actually, harmful. Those commercial movements that have taken place in past decades have proven to be harmful, and they have led to the death of millions of people because we are not prepared. We're dependent upon the supply chains which are in the hands of major transnational companies. Nevertheless, when we hear some political leaders that we have to change after the pandemic and this and that, and the European Union, they still have the same trade agenda: green capitalism and authoritarian capitalism. And a new point, given the last movements in terms of managing the 2008 financial crisis, there's a lot of leakage of transnational capital. Many players who violate human rights in those countries, and countries that foster environmental destruction, they are revived or they are rescued with public manage in the European Union. So we're not only talking about this political crisis in the Union that has generated internal tensions between neoliberalism and the countries that have right-wing or extreme right-wing countries, as we see with those laws against LGBT people, with institutional homophobia, institutional racism. And yesterday, the European Commission presented this legislative proposal, which still has to be discussed in the European Parliament and the member countries. There will be a couple of years to debates. So that refers to the objective that the European Union has to reduce their greenhouse gases by 55% before 2030 in order to, quote unquote, decarbonize the European Union by 2050. If we look at the current policies, it's not going to happen. However, it's very important because there's one aspect that is not discussed, which is the emissions which are imported to the European Union. That's a very important factor because many goods and services are produced in Southeast Asian, mostly in China, but that does not account for the greenhouse gas emissions in Brazil, in Uruguay, and Argentina at the moment when the raw materials are extracted. Another piece of data which seems to be crucial is that 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions at the global level are the result of extracting and processing raw materials, and many of those emissions will take place in third-party countries, and they do not account for the European Union. Therefore, they are actually making tricks, both in what refers to this decarbonization in 2050, because most of the environmental destruction and the contamination is generated by the capitalist European Union economy in the other parts of the world. And that does not include the administrative package, which is a theme we will address during the debates, if possible, which are looking at starting this aggravation, which is taxes on the import of goods coming from countries that have a big carbon footprint. But this could be protectionism, undercover protectionism, particularly against China and other more impoverished countries. There's this theme which I consider to be very important to put us in the context of this European Mercosur Agreement, which is the discourse takes the major international forums versus the reality. And the reality is that the European Union is one of the biggest violators of human rights violators. Okay, we do implement solidarity campaigns with Fora Bolsonaro and all of the solidarity with social movements against the genocide and ecocide administration of Bolsonaro, but also the European Union systematically violates human rights with their economic and trade policies, but also very materially in the borders of the European Union, where thousands of people have been killed, numbers which have been increased since 2020 and 2021. Very well. Perhaps I should make some comments now about the legal analysis of what is a chapter on trade and sustainable development in this agreement between the European Union and the Mercosur. It is clear enough that many studies, both made by non-governmental organizations or by universities or by international agencies, they all make it clear that there's this situation which the European Union Mercosur Agreement, looking at increasing imports and exports of goods and services, particularly raw materials, from the Mercosur to the European Union, which was also addressed by Ademar, and also the import of goods such as vehicles, automobiles, from the European Union to the Mercosur countries. This is actually going to lead to increased greenhouse gas emissions and also to greater deforestation and to greater diversity losses and increased environmental damages, particularly in the Mercosur countries, such as the chemical contamination, the soil erosion, and in the social realm. Near all studies speak of increased human rights violations, particularly against local communities and indigenous communities. So, the chapter on trade and sustainable development does not reinforce the commitments by Mercosur countries and European Union countries, which already have them under the International Agreement on Biodiversity or on the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. There's this ambiguity in the specific obligations coming out of the commitments undertaken in these international agreements on biodiversity or climate change. There is a deficiency on the part of the dispute resolution mechanism to fight the violations in this chapter. So perhaps there's a part that does not comply with the current text. And if they don't do that, they fail to do that, how are they going to solve their disputes? They do not provide a legal framework that is solid enough in order to address other social and environmental issues because of the limited reach of that chapter. So they talk about climate change, they talk about diversity, but many other issues such as chemical contamination, which has been proven by material studies made by researchers from Brazil, for instance, who have signaled that there's export of products that are forbidden in the European Union, but are massively used in Brazil, in Argentina, and other Mercosur countries, which should be totally banned. And they affect thousands of people who either develop any disease or die because of the effects of those chemicals. Some mechanisms are not binding in this chapter. The commitments seem to be too vague and too imprecise, and there's also weakness to the institutional structures which are put in place to enforce those commitments. And a very recent example is that the severe state crimes and human rights violations committed in Colombia to provide police repression against the social protests arising in Colombia are a clear violation of the democratic clause in the agreement between the European Union, Colombia, and Peru, where the commercial part was provisionally operational in 2012, and the democratic clause, which is in that agreement, is a clause in that agreement, but that has not been made effective after so many years because there are some states in the European Union whose national parliaments have not ratified that part. So, two contradicting responses from the European Union to the parliaments. Now, why, in the face of those crimes that are being committed in Colombia, why don't they suspend the trade agreement with Colombia? One answer is that this part is not enforced, and the other answer is that we don't know how to do it. So that's what we refer to when the chapter in this agreement does not establish clear institutional structures to apply, to enforce those commitments. In closing, this chapter on trade and sustainable development does not include any significant modification concerning the supply chains. This is a theme that the Brazilian Association of Indigenous People have denounced when they came 2 years ago to the European Union to actually report on indigenous rights violations, and where individuals from those indigenous peoples are murdered because there's no control on the supply chain, no control over the supply chain. There's no information about where social environmental damages is caused. Mining and land grabbing. We have two major crimes in the mining sector in Brazil in recent years. So the agreement does not ensure how the environmental commitments are going to be enforced under this chapter, and they do not protect human rights. And what about the critical environments such as Cerrado and Amazon? Because they do not include consultation to local communities, nor do they include transparency mechanisms that will help keep track of the raw materials which are extracted right now. And there is no information, meaning there's no free access information channels on these agreements in order to keep track of the impacts caused by extraction of those raw materials, which are eventually exported to the European Union. As a conclusion, the agreement does not contain any legal protection to local communities. If, for instance, if they are affected by extracting raw materials in connection to exports such as iron, gold, oil or gas, or soybeans or sugarcane. When these communities are poisoned, when their water sources are depleted, and when the climate is destructed, we cannot take any restrictive measure to trade by virtue of the clauses in this agreement. So the agreement does not contemplate a potential solution to the existing trade relations, which are very harmful to nature and to human rights. Thank you very much, Tom. Great speech. Now I'd call your attention to a couple of things. One of them is treating the environment and the climate and social environmental issues as a sort of non-tariff commercial trade barrier, as Tom calls our attention. And the other thing is on this approach concerning global production chains. There are many aspects to this discussion, but I will focus on this very brief comment of mine, which is the materiality of these global production chains, because as I said at the beginning, when we promote these debates and discussions about such complex themes, which seem so abstract and so far removed from our daily lives, the point, the questions are actually asked this way purposefully because we lose track of these commercial flows. The fact that they have materiality. So when we talk about international trade, we're also talking about the logistic infrastructure in place in those territories. And nowadays in Brazil, we're going through this process of interiorization of those infrastructures, of those logistic infrastructures, meaning highways, waterways, ports. They're all going through this interiorization process. Historically, they were located on the coastline of the country, which is a very extensive coastline, and they are now moving because of cost-benefit issues and commercial issues. They are moving inwards into the country, particularly to the Amazon, the so-called North Arch region, We also know that logistic infrastructures are very impactful from the social environmental point of view. They produce deforestation, they are conducive to wildfires, and they produce land grabbing in the logic of expanding the agricultural frontier, and also because of this anticipation, which I mean, meaning the mere announcement of a construction or of a project for many different aspects of logistic infrastructure, such as Ferrogrão, which is this railroad that's being planned from Sinop in the state of Mato Grosso all the way to Itaituba in the state of Pará. The mere announcement of that intention, that railroad, the expectation to have that railroad built, will start triggering a whole series of very mean processes from the environmental and climate process of deforestation, fires, has also social, from the social point of view, land grabbing, violence in the countryside, evictions, expulsions. So the materiality of this discussion on international trade is very important to be in the forefront of our minds. Then, in addition to logistics, the productive chains which rely on this logistics for export purposes. So when we speak about soybeans, for instance, we're talking about this single crop system, extensive single crop system, which is increasing production in this area, is not, as Ademar mentioned, the result of absorbing technology, which will already bring forth many different issues. This industry is very important in this process of increasing commercial capabilities and this production of those commodities, but also by the extension of private rural land, which is a major issue in the country. Land conflicts are the buzzwords nowadays, and they are reflected in discussions on approving this bill mentioned by Tom, PL 263, which we refer to as the PL, or the Bill of Law of the land grabbing, which facilitates land grabbing processes. And it's also connected to other bills of law, such as the PL 191 or PL 490, which are bills of law that authorize for the invasion or encroaching indigenous land in relation to the purpose of economic exploration in these territories. So we're also going through the process of discussing and approving at the National Congress. We're discussing this bill of law on estrangerization of land, meaning selling national territory, selling Brazilian land to foreign investors. We have this bill of law for environmental licensing, which sort of weakens the standards on environmental licensing at the international level, as we have major restrictions to public budgets, public budgeting to the agencies which are related to the environment. The very Ministry of the Environment, IBAMA, the other IBAMA and ICMBio, in a process which we refer to as dismantling governance of social environmental policy in Brazil, which are intended to serve or to meet these market demands so that the Brazilian state can generate a favorable business environment for territorialization of investments. So what we see is the Brazilian state making a move in order to meet these excessive and abusive demands made by the private sector in Brazil. And this has been done by means of this process of displacing public investment from the command and control agencies to the hands of the private sector. So we have referred to that process as market environmentalism. Not only to establish the processes of the greenwashing processes, which are those measures that are supposed to be for the benefit of the environment adopted by the companies, but they eventually continue to pollute and to generate negative effects on the social and environmental side, but also refer to this transition, meaning when the state refrains from investing in public policies in order to invest in private initiative, the responsibility over the environmental protection, which is a very dramatic in Brazil and very accelerated process as well. So it's very important when Tom and Ademar call our attention to this aspect of not including public consultation in these agreements, because it reflects this environment where states are progressively refraining from developing or implementing public policies, command and control public policies as they are, and they transfer that to the families, to the private initiative. They just transfer the responsibility over environmental protection to them. So this is a neoliberal action per se, meaning you reduce the public part of it and you increase the private part of it. And we have to be very careful with that because it facilitates for removing the accountability on the part of the states and the companies over the negative impacts caused by economic activity to people's lives and to the territories. I don't know whether we have any questions. If we do, I will ask Felipe or whoever is also helping us to organize this meeting. But I was asked to share, to show with you, to show to you this publication, which is being launched today with this event. Can you see it? Can you see it? Yes, very good. So this is a text, the third text, which is being launched. Analysis of the environmental clause and free trade agreements between Mercosur and the European Union and Mercosur and EFTA. Again, authored by Ademar Mineiro. This publication is available from the REBRIP website for those who are interested, and it is for free. All it takes is download that so you can have it and read it. Tom, would you like to say something? Your comment about the infrastructure seemed to be very important. Also, comment on logistics, because if we analyze the environmental destruction in the European Union, creating the single market and creating the major infrastructure for transportation or by road or by air, airborne transportation, or ports, airports, all of those are in close connection with the big destruction of major biodiversity corridors, and they are the source of the big destruction of biodiversity and ecosystem in the European Union. So that's closely connected, and the European Union has subsidized, by means of public institutions, they have subsidized this public-private alliance for the development of major infrastructure in South America and the Mercosur countries mostly, in order to increase ports, airports, train stations, train systems, and roadway infrastructures, which have been funded by means of public institutions, by means of money for the cooperation for the development, in order to foster those infrastructures that you have just reported on. And there are many social environmental conflicts within the European Union, which are these infrastructure projects, pipelines, roads, railroads, or major ports, which are also on the first line where there are communities fighting against those infrastructures, as in Brazil. And this is why, in many reports made by the European Union's Court of Accounts in terms of the use of public money to increase that infrastructure or those different infrastructures in order to enable the benefits, meaning to give the benefits to major transnational companies that organize trade across the world and in the European Union, they are connected to corruption processes and malfeasance of funds because there's overprice to those infrastructures. So that points directly at corruption scandals and malfeasance of public money, such as Brazil in connection to Odebrecht, for instance, also in Europe. We have hundreds or dozens or hundreds of companies which are active in the construction field, which have used public money for the construction of major infrastructure in order to support the expansion and investment models in Latin America, or to fund and buy the willingness of political parties whereby the government administrations facilitate those processes of public construction, so the schemes of corruption and malfeasance of public money to the construction of of infrastructure, which are very harmful to the environment. They are facilitated in these agreements. An important point you make, Tom, and that reminds me of this very important thing to remember when we address the neo-colonial dimension of these agreements, because we usually analyze the neo-colonial dimension of those agreements in the sense of the inequality of trade terms, trade standards, which are demanded as those countries are included in the major value structure. But the infrastructure that's demanded by trade, they are very much representative of colonial and neo-colonial processes. The very word, the very concept of development comes forth initially to designate what you say exactly, meaning external foreign investment, particularly European investment, in countries of the global south, particularly during the period of African colonization process. So the word development comes forth in order to designate capital exports. It comes into existence in order to designate this movement of investing in major infrastructure as a mechanism to recycle surplus on the part of European countries. So there lies a very important connection between trade and new colonial processes, or processes that seek to update the coloniality. I don't know, perhaps Ademar would like to comment. I'd like to make three brief comments, Tatiana. First, I mentioned in passing, but I think it's important to elaborate on that, which is the fact that conclusion of those agreements can only be achieved when you have this conjugation of liberal governments from the point of view of the Mercosur countries. So the agreement is entered into when you have, for instance, the Macri administration in Argentina, the Temer administration in Brazil, which is the result of an institutional disruption, and in the sequence wrapped up in the Bolsonaro administration, meaning this vision, this ultra-liberal view was crucial to leading to that agreement, meaning in order to conclude negotiations, it was important to have Bolsonaro ahead of the Brazilian government. And curiously enough, from the point of view of Europeans, the image they have of the Bolsonaro administration is what has stopped advancing the agreement. Once he came to office, from the real point of view, Bolsonaro proved to be the anti-popular president, a president that's anti-environment. And that has stopped institutional advancement, that has stopped support from the national parliaments and from the European parliaments to the agreement. So it's important for people to make some kind of connection between the current government, which is this one, this ugly one, that stops the agreement from being approved, and the fact that the agreement was only wrapped up by this government that looks so ugly. So I think what we miss from the point of view of the European countries, what we miss is this connection so that you can develop a more coherent political discussion about what the agreement process was all about. The second point was also mentioned, but I think it is worth reinforcing that, which is the famous chapter on trade and sustainable development in the agreement. This chapter, which is so much appreciated because of the concerns with social and environmental issues, that is the chapter that's actually an outlier, while all of the remainder can be legally disputed from the point of view of transnational companies, for instance, as Tom mentioned. This chapter cannot be demanded because it may be just for show from the political point of view. So it's important for us to make this point, and also to say, would this chapter save the agreement if it were well written and also demandable, meaning binding in the negotiation process? No, because the general objective of the agreement is in this. It reinforces the type of relationship of the Mercosur countries and the relationship with the environment. But this is a chapter that works as a statement of intentions, but it cannot be held to the truth. And agreement on good intentions cannot be held to be true. And the third point is this debate involving negotiators, governments, and European parliamentary members who are favorable to the agreement. They say that, well, you had better talk to us than talk to China. The relationship with China is, a relationship with undemocratic countries, which has a development project that is very destructive of the environment. Okay, let's look at it. First of all, from the point of view of regional countries, agreement with the European Union or an agreement with EFTA is not contradictory to increasing relations with China, much the other way around, because insofar as the agreement with EFTA and European Union is actually impoverishing the societies of the Mercosur countries, because it reinforces development strategies that are based on these commodity producing sectors. They concentrate income or in those. So the more the populations of the Mercosur are, the more the Chinese products which are cheaper. So this agreement, far from approximating Mercosur countries from the point of view of trade, far from approximating that with the European Union, they will actually approximate, apart from this sector that I just mentioned, they will bring those Mercosur countries, which are the main consumer markets, to China. So the side effect of this agreement is actually reinforcing an approximation of China from the point of view of the large mass of consumers in the Mercosur countries, however impoverished they are. Those are the 3 points I'd like to share with you. Thank you very much, Ademar. I see that the debate has sort of heated up, and the networks which are republishing us. So I am going to ask the questions which are in the chat box, so be reassured of that. But before that, however, this brother from Amigos da Terra, he is here with us, and he has to make a brief comment about the criticism that Amigos da Terra, his organization, has passed on the environmental clause and the proposal of the traditional environmental protocols. So, Alberto, be welcome here, first of all. You have the floor. Thank you, Tatiana, and brothers and sisters. It's very good to see all of you, because it's been a while that we haven't seen. From Amigos de la Tierra, from Uruguay, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and the European Union. This is an agreement. It's totally a new colonial by nature. So when it comes to the chapter on goods, the agreement is going to involve environmental consequences that are role. Nevertheless, we also denounce that this agreement between the European Union and the Mercosur, more than a trade agreement, similar to other free trade agreement, so more than a trade agreement, is a new constitution. It requires adapting all of the methodological rules. It requires homogeneous legislation across those countries, and to support the international companies and the international value chain. So this agreement, as we see, it includes another 19 chapters. Some of them have already been mentioned here, but so all of them have been set to the same standard, which is neoliberalism. Means reducing the role of states in legislation and regulation. So what was being mentioned at the beginning, meaning legislation that was ongoing in Brazil, and as I see it, it's very good to have all of those capacities, the state capacities to regulate and the value chain. So directly or indirectly, this is something that's going to have an effect on environmental institutionality, the state capacity to look at the workings of these transnational companies, which are the main ones involved in those exports. Now, coming to the chapter of trade and sustainable development, more than everything, we are totally in agreement that adapting this chapter in order to make it a thing, because it's not yet. So if it becomes a binding agreement, it doesn't solve the problem, but it will come much closer. As a civil society, we request that change not to be linked. So from the point of view of dispute resolution in the chapter on free trade agreements, it refers to the commercial aspects, not the other aspects, the differences in the environmental and human rights issues. They have to be addressed in their respective forms, but not by means of a dispute resolution system of an entity that looks at the commerce exclusively. And that means that we will try to remove the in order to make the street even more commercial. That's what I wanted to share, because from the European Union, there are voices which are complaining, saying that this is this chapter on sustainable development has to be binding, and the main gain for the European Commission and this free trade agreement much bigger than than the other gains. Thank you, Alberto. A very important intervention you made. Alberto called our attention to something that I was going to ask further in the future, but I will say it now. He mentions this possibility of adding environmental protocols to these agreements in order to try and improve, to respond to this criticism which is being made to the agreement. So I'd like to ask you on the initiative of developing environmental protocols and the possibility of a split. Now, what is that? What's the split, and what are the implications of this split? So, who would like to start?
Bien,
Tom, please, you have the floor.
Bien, Alberto, por los comentarios. Solo un pequeño comentario por qué hay...
Thank you, Albert, for your comments. A brief comment about the number of legal studies to show the non-binding nature of the chapter on trade and sustainable development, because a major argument on the part of the European Commission, who has negotiated this agreement with Mercosur, but also with the governments of the member states, is that with the European Union agreement, so in addition to this commercial trade agreement, there will be protection to the environment in the Mercosur countries. This is a crucial argument presented to justify ratifying this agreement. This is why there's this initial effort to show that this chapter on trade and sustainable trade is not enough for greater protection of the environment, much less of the human rights. Importantly enough, in order to add this new element to the stock, is that in the European Union, they are actually violating the European Union Treaty, Article 11 and Article 21 of their own treaty. They should have the protection of the environment and sustainable development. And just recently, 22nd of March 2021, the defender of the people of Europe said that the European Communion did not comply with the obligation of having to producing a environmental impact study before concluding negotiations with the Mercosur countries. So that reflects in a poor conclusion of that report. And the non-economic factors are not considered. Civil society's concerns are not to be put forth. So that includes considering the impact on the environment, on the indigenous peoples, on family farming, and so on. The legal studies developed around the possibility of presenting an additional statement or a additional protocol, and which we won't see them starting again. And I'm here. I am in agreement with what was presented by Alberto. So there's no interpretation protocol will surface the legal failures because of the nature of the agreement and human rights. Many of the arguments that I tried to share with you. So if we look at the study of impact provided to the London Economic Choice, it's interesting to observe that now when everybody's talking about digitalization, changing paradigm shift, and renewable energies, the Green New Deal in the European Union, curiously enough, an impact study is not even analyzed as the demand of more minerals and ores in order to move with renewable energies in the European Union. That's going to have an impact in Brazil and the other Mercosur systems. Because very clearly from the reports made by the European Union,
scientific body, no?
They have this scientific body which provides scientific reports for the European Commission. So it clarifies, for instance, for batteries electric automobiles and electrified transports. For that purpose, European Union is going to need 60 times more lithium than it currently explores. Where does lithium come from? Part of it comes from Australia. Batteries are ready made by China, but also a big part of it comes from Argentina. That would increase lithium extractivism with major impact on indigenous and countryside communities, also impacts on water and access to water, and many other human rights violations. So that means increased imports of aluminum and ore, which would come basically from Brazil. But another point is to show how can importing biomass in order to meet those objectives of decarbonization objectives of the European Union, and that imply more chains for ethanol or in the form of palm oil, in order to replace the process of fuel fossils. And that increases the demand for biomass. The scientists in the European Union are saying that this will generate a bigger impact on the land use, particularly in countries of the Mercosur, as well as Brazil, because of the destruction of ecosystems and deforestation. That concern has to be brought forth when there's a lot of talk in Europe, uh, which was presented this week, therefore, as the European Commission. But uh, we can see this discourse around green capitalism and how we're going to get away from this pandemic through an ecological transition. But nobody speaks about the huge concrete impacts, such as that Tiana mentioned, the material impacts on its in addition of to the extraction of those raw materials, which are crucial for the transition by the European Union. Wonderful, Tom. As we keep talking, this idea of this updating new coloniality keeps presenting itself in different manners through discussions. So that's very good. Before I pass the floor back to Adama, perhaps we can have a talk about the splits so that we can think about the last round of questions about the future. Which are just the main questions listed in the chat here. So I'd like to mention that in Brazil, for instance, major contribution by the country to climate change is exactly in the use of land, which connects very easily with what Tom has just presented, that it connected with the discussion on the global value chain as the way in which global South countries entered these chains as commodities exporters and also exporters of mineral and energy related commodities. So it's very important for us to have an eye on how the climate change is expressed or manifest in each territory. I think this is a main piece of criticism we have been passing on this decarbonization discourse, and also a compensation on greenhouse gas, buying carbon credits in order to compensate for those emissions, which include intra-global value chains, which is an issue. We're looking at how to neutralize this gas emissions have come from the chains of value, which addresses our conversation all the way from logistical infrastructure, which provide the skeleton to this global capitalism and support the commercial processes for international trade, all the way to the chains per se. So the mineral, the cattle breeding, and others. Ademar, you have the floor. And then I'll pass the floor back to Tom so we can have brief comments, brief closure comments. Two things. First, about what Alberto said. I think it's important for us to understand that there's an international dispute supported by major companies, supported by major law firms, and legal consultant groups, on the prevalence of visions, agreements in case of conflicts, the rights conflicts. From the point of view of society, we always understood the social and environmental rights are prevalent upon commercial rights. So how much it doesn't make sense to put forth the human relations sources or labor rights, environmental rights within the realm of governmental agreements, because those international conventions, which are already in the nature, given the discussions around the UN and the ILO and COP, and our understanding, they prevail upon the traditional trade agreements. They should subordinate trade agreements. In that sense, it's not very consistent to make a division to reinforce negotiations, specific negotiations on human rights issues and social issues, environmental issues, and so on, because this will have to be negotiated in another sphere, particularly because of resources to constructing uh, comments. Rules are actually provided by this reality, and this is something that has to be understood, and this would be my view concerning that. Thank you, Ademar. A very brief comment on my part about the split, because we're coming to the last track of 10 minutes. Curiously enough, Tatiana, I've been negotiating this agreement for 20 years. So they have just announced the end of negotiations in 2019, but they continue to negotiate on some of the details of that agreement with no transparency at all. There's no information about it because just recently the European Union Commerce Secretary said that they should continue negotiating something that's in the text, which is contradictory to some other previous political leaders. Just now, the European Union, they commissioned a legal studio in order to negotiate with Antonio, or the proposal to divide the agreement between these the commercial part and the political cooperation part of the agreement as part of the succession agreement. And this is because the European Union member states in 2018, in a document issued by the trade ministers, says that and the commercial agreements of the European Union, the agreements with Mexico and other countries, they are coming up as agreements in Japan for recent years. Japan, Singapore, and Vietnam, for instance. Now, why do we want to divide them in two? Because in the sequence of European Court of Justice, they said that the European Commission have the competency to negotiate agreements, trade agreements with the other countries. The only thing that's needed is ratifying the concept of the European Union, which are the governments of the member states and the concept. Now, why was there this dispute on the Canadian agreement, the European Union with Canada? They put together the small parliament and a regional government in Belgium. They stopped it, they vetoed, and they kept the Belgian government could actually ratify this agreement with Canada. This is going to provide for the following. They are looking at dividing that in order to be able to accelerate the ratification process rather than wait for the national parliaments. Uh, One was so democratic on the part of the countries in the European Union, but they also want to accelerate the process in face of the potential political crisis in the Mercosur system, which will provide for greater ratification in the country. And right now, in civil society in Europe, we're putting pressure on the national admissions not to allow for this element that's being prepared on the part of the European Union. Thank you, Tom. It's important to reinforce around what you said that there's the important difference between the European Union and the Mercosur. The European Union is a consumer community. This debate comes to ratify the Mercosur. Obviously, Tom points at this important democratic point around the need to internationalize on a country-by-country basis. Even in the case of Europe, which has different bylaws, it's a community. It's it's not a customs element. On this debate on updating this agreement between the European Union and the Mercosur is: does this agreement require approval of the internalization process to be implemented, meaning absorbed by the national legislation, saying what the agreement presents? Does that require that recognition by each country, or is the agreement in force only after all of the countries go through the process of internationalizing them? I don't know whether it's clear, but in the Mercosur case, there's an ongoing discussion on whether the agreement is enforced, progressively enforced for each country, insofar as each country internalizes the agreement in their domestic legislation. So that's option number one. Or if the agreement would only be enforced after all Mercosur member countries go through the process of ratifying that, which could take another large period of time before it comes into being. So this discussion is ongoing, and it's important to point at the difference between the institutional legal issue in the European Union and in the Mercosur, so that we do not mix up the processes and think that they are the same elements, but they are not. So this is the very last moments of our time. So I'd like to have one last round of questions about the future, meaning how do we see the development of all of those discussions going forward, if this agreement is finally issued or not? But mostly this question by Yara Pesikowski from Ineski. She sends best regards to you, Tom, and should like to welcome you in the discussion area. So she says she'd like to hear you and Adamar about an alternative view of the future concerning those agreements. What are the possible worlds that we are generating today? Graciela Rodriguez from the Equit Institute, she also asks, what are these mechanisms of non-tariff barrier using the environment and the climate discussion for the agreement? Would that apply to gender and to human rights issues as well? I think I will stick to those two questions, and I'll pass the floor to you so you can provide very brief answers. I'll give you 2 minutes. Each one will have 2 minutes to try to make a super synthesis of those issues, and then we will wrap up. Adamar, you have the floor. Actually, to answer Graciela's question first, in theory, yes. In theory, all human rights barriers women's rights, so on, all of the barriers could be used as non-tariff barriers. Now, what remains to be seen is if and when it is of the interest of major transnational corporations, which are the ones that actually conduct the process. So if they will take that into consideration, this is a major point. We have already seen questions about human rights issues for some countries. For Iran, for instance, it's quite common, but it's not for the neighboring Saudi Arabia. So we have seen that violations are of the same type of nature. So how will companies or countries like to use that? Well, the way they will use it is actually different. The other issue, the other question actually, concerning the future, as the IATA put forth, and using the presence of our Uruguayan friend Alberto in this discussion, which is beyond the issue of Mercosur or European Union. What we are discussing is the future of the Mercosur. Be speaking right now about an abstraction, which is a Mercosur which might not even be existing in existence at some point during this conversation. The last meetings between governments, common market policies, as discussed within the Mercosur, they have shown sharp differences amongst countries about the Mercosur. Also, this issue that international trade agreements posed by Uruguay in the sense that it could negotiate the agreement in separate. So beyond this discussion, I think that a very complex future that is at stake is the future of the Mercosur. So from the point of view of the peoples, we have always been very appreciative of regional interaction in our region. And we see this as a possibility of a differentiated development strategy. So this is what is in discussed at the moment. And this is what is up to us, Mercosur organizations, to look at that, to implement that. That's how I see it. A very important point, and I added in the chat, which Mercosur are we talking about?
Tom,
okay, Tom, 2 minutes, please. I'm not going to be able to answer that in 2 minutes. First, concerning Graciela's question, and the theme that Ademar touched on before. If international rights are human rights or international trade rights, which one is above the other, or which lies on top of the other? And second, the agreement on international rights, human rights should be above commercial and trade rights, and it's not the way it is. And the construction of the European Union and the Mercosur, they have shown that trade rights actually lie above international rights and human rights and the various environmental agreements. So if we look at this inaction against climate crisis in the past 3 decades, we will see the main reason has been that if governments, the current government, looks at the structural causes of the global environmental emergence, would actually conflict capitalism, and that would threaten a minority elite which has the power on the economy, on politics, and on the means of communication. This can be seen very clearly in the past 3 years, though the different climate change summits have failed, and international negotiations on biodiversity or on climate, they have failed to achieve their objectives. What has been successful was the process of economic globalization, as the World Trade Organization was created with approval and implementation of hundreds or even thousands of trade and investment agreements. There's more than 1,300. In that sense, I think that European Union Mercosur commercial trade agreement would actually deepen the process of construction of the economy, which is a normative barrier to any alternative economic policy that might be looking seriously at the need to generate structural change and to also take seriously the possibility of putting life in the center of it all and conserving and actually looking after the ecosystems which have been shown as one of the main causes behind the emergence of the coronavirus pandemic. So looking at the future, I'd say that the organizations we have seen in the past 20 years, they have shown a great capacity to resist and to mobilize. And I will ask at Rebrip because the first resistance, which warns about the negotiations between Mercosur and the European Union, are the activities that you organized in Rio de Janeiro in 1999, when the negotiations were actually starting. So, ever since, we have seen many different moments of liaison amongst the social movement between Europe and Latin America. Some of those networks, they have provided alternatives with different summits across the years. Also, Rio Plus 20 summit in Rio de Janeiro in 2020. So right now, this is a very important moment of difficulty in terms of international solidarity, not only because of the offensive provided by the extreme right wing, both in Europe but also in Latin America, as we have seen, with some exceptions which are always hopeful, such as the Constitution in Chile, actions in Peru, and also the governmental shift in Argentina. But Ademar and Tatiana were pointing in their introductory remarks that the PT government in Brazil was the one that promoted in their own time negotiations around this new agreement. So in a certain way, the construction of the Mercosur was based on the project to develop a single market with the European Union, which is a neoliberal project, which is conducted by economical power. So the social summit in Paraguay in 2009, when there was the state coup d'etat in Honduras, and with discussions that it opened up that started these conversations with the social movements, looking at developing another type of regional integration, which were trumped by many different coup d'etat in Latin America, as well as alternative processes in Europe, which were discontinued by the economic crisis, but also by the offensive by the right wing and the extreme right wing. So we are going through difficult times for the international solidarity. Therefore, it's ever more important to stop the ratification of this Mercosur-European Union agreement. So we're building this Atlantic alliance, which involves more than 450 organizations in the Mercosur countries as well as the European countries. So we have conducted online meetings and we have put together many material initiatives to move forward on a more systematic basis. I think this agreement amongst different countries have been strengthened. Europe and Asia, they have put more than 2 million companies around the agreement, and many regional agreements with including Ireland, the Netherlands, and Ireland. The European Parliament has said that given the current circumstances, we cannot ratify the agreement, and there are also many different governments which feel the pressure of society in Austria, in France, Luxembourg. So there's this very strong contradiction because they talk about ecological transition and then pandemic, and then there's a mercantilized agenda. So there's a pressure exercised on the countries in order to stop them ratifying the agreement. So the extreme right-wing agenda by Bolsonaro, the forest fires and deforestation of the Amazon, they have had media and political impact in Europe, which has supported this campaign. So we have to be preparing for for future years because this process is likely to continue, particularly in a scenario which changes to progressive government. We are not going to allow for this agreement to be ratified. So we have very concrete proposals on the table. And a few months ago, actually, there are European networks which work on global justice. We have signed this document where we talk about the need to overcome the neoliberal framework of commercial policies. And that means providing a radical change of those relations, not only refraining from ratifying this agreement, but also to look at this as suicide, which implies the current agreements that we have in place, which is extremely serious in terms of environmental destruction and violation to human rights. And that means that we have to eventually reach trade. We're facing this trade, which is absolutely irrational, production of goods and services, which could be produced at the local level in the Mercosur countries, which is exported by European Union to the Mercosur market. This is absolutely injustifiable, and vice versa. That grain is exported to feed the pig in Spain or European Union, so then they export pork to China. This is an absolutely mean agreement and irrational because we have concrete proposals to overcome the current framework of international trade rights or trade law and the agreements which are based on the WTO, and that also derives from this debate which dates back from 1990s, which we have to conclude fighting for the institutional structure, which is the WTO and the European Union, to support community-based structures for alternatives that are based on the feminist economy rather than on neoliberal economy and economic growth, which is being forced from the part of the Mercosur government and the other part. Thank you, Tom. With this very important closing remarks, we will bring our debates to an end today. As I said, it was a third in a long journey. I will quickly reinforce what the next two debates will be about. Towards the RIP Assembly, our next encounter will discuss the negotiation process on intellectual property within the WTO. And the fifth debate before the beginning of the RIP Assembly, we'll have this discussion on digital economy, a very up-to-date theme, and I hope you will not miss this one. So thank you very much once again, Ademar, Tom, Alberto, for your contributions. It was indeed a great pleasure. I think it was a very high-level conversation, and I hope to have you in future moments. Thank you. All the best regards. I'll see you. I'll see you in a future event. Best regards.